In September 1944, David McCampbell landed on the USS Essex after downing 9 Japanese aircraft in a single flight. 9 in less than 90 minutes. He was the commander of Air Group 15, 34 years old, and had just become the deadliest pilot in U.S. Navy history. But there was no celebration. 3 days later, High Command issued an order that shocked the fleet. McCampbell was grounded, at the peak of his career, at the moment of his maximum effectiveness. The official reason made no sense, but the real one was far darker. Born in Alabama and an Annapolis graduate, McCampbell discovered his true talent late. It wasn't just competence, but a natural gift for processing spatial geometry at over 200 mph. But talent without war is merely potential, and after Pearl Harbor, McCampbell transformed into the sharpest weapon the Navy possessed. McCampbell spent the early years of the war in training and instruction roles, which deeply frustrated a man who knew his place was in combat. But this forced wait ended up becoming an unexpected strategic advantage. While training new pilots, he absorbed combat reports from the Pacific, studied Japanese tactics, and analyzed attack and defense patterns. When he finally received his combat command in 1943, taking over Air Group 15, he wasn't just a talented pilot. He was an obsessive student of aerial warfare, with 3 years of accumulated tactical analysis in his mind. His first combat mission took place during Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. And it was there that David McCampbell began to build a reputation that would completely change his life. On the morning of June 11, 1944, over Guam, McCampbell led a formation of F-6F Hellcats against a numerically superior Japanese force. The Hellcat was a formidable aircraft, designed specifically to dominate the Japanese fighters that had massacred American pilots in the early years of the war. Faster, tougher, with more firepower than the Zero, the Hellcat was America's technological answer to early Japanese air dominance. But technology alone didn't win battles. The pilot made the difference. And that day, McCampbell demonstrated exactly what it meant to combine a superior machine with exceptional skill. He spotted a Zero trying to get behind a friendly Hellcat, calculated the intercept vector, dove from a higher altitude with the sun at his back, blinding the enemy pilot, and opened fire at 200 yards. The Zero exploded in an orange fireball, his first confirmed victory, but he didn't stop. On that same flight, he maneuvered into firing position on 2 more Zeros, destroying both with short, precise bursts from his 650 caliber machine guns. 3 victories in a single mission. His men witnessed something that transcended standard training. They saw tactical mastery in action. Throughout June and July 1944, as American forces advanced through the Marianas, McCampbell continued to rack up victories. But what separated the great aces from the legendary ones wasn't just the number of kills, it was his calculated consistency. Many pilots had spectacular days followed by weeks of mediocre results. McCampbell was different. He applied the same tactical principles every single time. Altitude before engagement, sun at his back whenever possible. A diving approach to maximize speed and minimize exposure time. Short, disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition. Never chase an enemy beyond the point of safe return. He turned aerial combat into a reproducible science, and his pilots began to copy his methods. Air Group 15 became one of the most lethal squadrons in the Pacific Fleet, not by luck, but through deliberate technical leadership. On June 19, 1944, what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot took place. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched a massive strike against Task Force 58, sending waves of aircraft in a desperate attempt to reverse American momentum. The result was an aerial slaughter. Poorly trained Japanese pilots, flying technologically inferior aircraft, faced Hellcats flown by increasingly confident veterans. McCampbell was in the air when the first wave arrived. He and his wingman intercepted a formation of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers protected by Zeros. Standard tactics called for attacking the fighters first. McCampbell did the opposite. He dove through the Zero escort, accepting the risk, and destroyed 2 bombers before the enemy fighters could react. He knew the bombers were the real threat to the ships. Without them, the Zeros were irrelevant. He prioritized the strategic objective over individual victory. That day, McCampbell downed 5 enemy aircraft. But more importantly, he saved American ships by eliminating bombers before they could launch their torpedoes. His commanders took notice. This pilot wasn't just hunting for kills to pad his personal score, he was winning missions. August 1944 brought even more intense action during operations against the Philippines. On August 29th, McCampbell led a fighter sweep over Leyte Gulf and encountered significant resistance. During a clash that lasted over an hour, he demonstrated a tactical variation that left his wingmen impressed. He was engaging a Zero in a tight turn when he noticed another enemy positioning for a deflection shot on a friendly Hellcat. Most pilots would have continued chasing the first target, ensuring a confirmed kill. McCampbell broke off the engagement, executed an inverted half-loop, rolled into pursuit position, and destroyed the second Zero before it could fire. He sacrificed a guaranteed victory to save a wingman. But then, he repositioned, found the first Zero again trying to escape at low altitude, dived after it, and shot it down as well. 2 victories, 1 pilot saved, 0 losses. That was the McCampbell standard. Lethal efficiency combined with tactical leadership. His men knew that if they were in danger, their commander would abandon his own score to save them. This created a loyalty and trust that transcended normal military hierarchy. They would fly through hell for him, and soon, they would have to do exactly that. September 1944 was the month David McCampbell cemented his status as the supreme ace of American naval aviation. On September 24th, he and his wingman Roy Rushing were conducting a combat air patrol over the fleet when air control reported a massive enemy formation approaching. 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell and Rushing were alone. The logical response would have been to call for reinforcements and keep their distance until more fighters arrived. But the time needed to launch a full interception would allow the Japanese to reach attack position over the vulnerable aircraft carriers. McCampbell made a decision that would define his career. He and Rushing would attack immediately, 2 against 60. The idea wasn't to destroy the entire formation, it was to disrupt it, to cause enough chaos to delay the attack and allow a full air defense to form. He positioned himself above and behind the enemy formation, dived at maximum speed, and opened fire on the lead bomber. The plane exploded. Before the escort fighters could react, he had already destroyed a second bomber and was maneuvering for a third. The formation began to disintegrate. Japanese pilots broke formation trying to find the attackers. Tactical discipline evaporated, and as this happened, more Hellcats arrived from the fleet. The Japanese attack failed. In that single engagement, McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft. 9. Rushing destroyed 6, 15 victories between 2 pilots. It was a statistic that seemed impossible, but dozens of witnesses confirmed it. Gun cameras provided visual evidence. There was no doubt. David McCampbell had executed the most devastating individual combat mission in naval aviation history up to that point. When he landed on the Essex, with barely 10 minutes of fuel in his tanks and only 6 bullets left in his guns, the deck crew greeted him like a god of war. Combat correspondents swarmed him for interviews. His pilots gathered around in disbelief at what they'd heard over the radio. David McCampbell had become a living legend. With over 30 confirmed kills, he was unstoppable. Indispensable. The perfect American hero for the war effort back home. And that was exactly what sealed his fate. 3 days later, on September 27th, it wasn't a medal that arrived, but a direct order. Total flight restriction. McCampbell was forbidden from flying offensive combat missions. At the absolute peak of his effectiveness, the Navy's greatest ace was out of the war. The official justification? Preservation of valuable resources. They claimed his training experience was too irreplaceable to be risked against Japanese artillery. It seemed rational. But McCampbell knew this wasn't the whole story. He responded through the appropriate channels, pointing out the obvious. His September 24th mission had demonstrated exactly why he should keep flying. He hadn't just survived combat against 60 Japanese aircraft. He had destroyed 9 of them and disrupted the entire enemy formation. No other pilot under his command possessed that level of situational awareness. No other pilot had developed his techniques for altitude advantage and strategic target selection. If the goal was to protect valuable resources, removing him from combat meant wasting precisely the tactical advantage the Navy had spent years developing. He presented the numbers. Since taking command of Air Group 15 in June 1944, his unit's combat effectiveness rates had increased by 40%. Pilot losses had decreased by 30%. His subordinates were applying the tactics he demonstrated in real combat, not in theoretical exercises. Removing him from the front lines didn't preserve knowledge. It interrupted the very mechanism that made that knowledge transferable. The official response he received was polite but inflexible. The decision had been made. His objections were noted and dismissed. And it was at that moment that David McCampbell began to realize the official justification wasn't the whole truth, because he wasn't the only one. When McCampbell began to quietly investigate, he discovered a disturbing pattern across Pacific naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia, another elite ace with 23 confirmed victories, had received similar restrictions just 2 weeks earlier. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, with 19 victories, had been transferred to administrative duties at Pearl Harbor. Commander Cecil Harris, 17 victories, restricted to defensive patrols. The Navy wasn't protecting valuable resources through prudent risk management. It was systematically removing its most successful pilots from active combat precisely when they reached the peak of their effectiveness. And the reason had absolutely nothing to do with tactical concerns. It had to do with propaganda and politics. In September 1944, the Pacific War was entering a critically important phase. American forces were preparing for the invasions of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and eventually mainland Japan. The War Department in Washington was deeply concerned about public morale. Europe was nearing victory, but the Pacific promised years of additional bloody combat. The Roosevelt administration needed heroes, not dead heroes. Living heroes who could appear in newsreels, go on war bond tours, give interviews to Life magazine demonstrating that America was winning. The logic was cold. A dead pilot is a tragedy. A dead ace is a public relations disaster. With over 30 victories, McCampbell became too valuable to risk. The Navy preferred a living symbol on a podium to a lethal weapon in the sky. Declassified documents confirmed this decades later with clinical clarity. Pilots with more than 20 victories were reclassified as propaganda assets. The priority was no longer winning battles. It was protecting the narrative. For a man who had turned aerial combat into a science, being locked into a role as a living propaganda poster was humiliating. He couldn't defy the order without facing court-martial, but the message echoing through the fleet was unmistakable. Mediocrity was safe. Extreme excellence was a threat the Navy wouldn't tolerate. McCampbell was trapped. A prisoner of his own success, forced to watch from the sidelines while men with half his experience risked their lives. The Navy didn't see pilots like him as human beings with agency and purpose. It saw assets to be managed. Pieces on a political chessboard where appearances mattered more than effectiveness. And if preserving those appearances meant wasting the rarest tactical talent naval aviation had produced, well, that was simply the cost of doing business. Because in the end, the Navy wasn't just fighting against Japan. It was fighting for the narrative, for the story that would be told back home, for the perception that would shape future budgets and political support. And in that war, David McCampbell wasn't an asset. He was a liability. a risk that needed to be managed, a hero who had become too valuable to allow to remain heroic. The impact of this decision went beyond the personal. Because the other pilots of Air Group 15 saw what happened to McCampbell, they understood the message. Be too good, become too famous, and you will be removed from the combat you trained your whole life to face. The message didn't encourage excellence, it encouraged calculated mediocrity. Fly well enough to survive, but not so well that you become a public relations problem. And as David McCampbell sat in his stateroom that September night, reading and rereading the order that effectively ended his combat career, he realized something that would fundamentally change how he viewed the naval institution. The Navy had gotten its propaganda. They had preserved their hero. But they had lost their best weapon. And the cost of that institutional betrayal went far beyond the career of a single pilot. But the consequences went far beyond McCampbell. The decision sent a shockwave through every squadron in the Pacific. Every elite pilot got the message: stand out too much, and the institution will cut you. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. Between October 1944 and the end of the war, the removal rate for pilots with more than 20 confirmed victories increased by 340%. Not because these pilots had been wounded, not because their skills had diminished, but because someone at the Bureau had made a cold calculation. An ace dead in combat was a bad headline. A living ace making public appearances was a recruitment tool. David McCampbell remained aboard the USS Essex, but his role had fundamentally changed. He was still the commander of Air Group 15. His name was still on the flight roster, but the orders were clear. Defensive missions only. Combat air patrols over the fleet. Nothing offensive. Nothing that would put him within range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire over ground targets. The Navy had turned its most lethal fighter pilot into a glorified watchman. The other pilots of Air Group 15 noticed. How could they not? The man who had shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single sortie was now flying protective circles while his subordinates executed the dangerous missions. Morale didn't plummet dramatically because McCampbell maintained his authority and respect. But something had changed. The implicit message was impossible to ignore. Stand out too much, and the institution will limit you. In January 1945, McCampbell was dispatched to the United States. The Navy needed him on podiums selling war bonds, not in cockpits shooting down enemies. But here is where the story takes a twist that the Navy didn't foresee. Over the following decades, as military historians began examining declassified records from the Bureau of Naval Personnel, a pattern emerged. The internal memo categorizing pilots with more than 20 victories as propaganda assets was not an isolated case. It was systematic policy. Documents revealed that the Navy had created a detailed risk matrix. Each ace received a score based on their propaganda value versus their operational tactical value. And when the propaganda value exceeded a specific threshold, administrative intervention was authorized. David McCampbell had crossed that threshold on the morning of September 24, 1944, when his kill count reached 30. The irony is sharp. The very institution that publicly celebrated individual combat expertise was systematically removing its most effective practitioners from the battlefield. And the cost was not merely symbolic. Post-war analyses of fighter squadron effectiveness revealed a measurable drop in tactical performance when experienced aces were removed prematurely. Air Group 15 continued to operate effectively after McCampbell's transfer. But the numbers tell a different story. Between February and August 1945, the Air Group's kill rate per sortie fell 17% compared to the period when McCampbell was leading offensive missions. His tactical innovations, his ability to read Japanese formation patterns, his skill in positioning flight elements for maximum effectiveness. All of this had been removed from the operational equation. The Navy got its propaganda. David McCampbell appeared at war bond rallies. He gave interviews to newspapers. His image was used in recruitment posters. And in December 1945, he received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman. The citation praised his bravery, his skill, his extraordinary contributions to the naval victory in the Pacific. But no part of that ceremony mentioned that the Navy had deliberately ended his combat career at its peak. No part acknowledged that the same institution decorating him had calculated that he was more valuable as a symbol than as a warrior. David McCampbell remained in the Navy after the war. He served in various administrative and training capacities. He retired in 1964 with the rank of captain. But men who served with him reported years later that McCampbell carried a quiet frustration, not open bitterness. He was too professional for that. But a sharp awareness that the institution to which he had dedicated his life had sacrificed his effectiveness on the altar of public perception. And here is the broader systemic truth that David McCampbell's story reveals. Military institutions, even during existential war, prioritize their own preservation and narrative management over pure tactical effectiveness. The Navy was not unique in this behavior. The Army Air Forces made similar calculations with their own bomber aces. The Royal Navy implemented parallel policies for highly decorated fighter pilots. The pattern is consistent across services and nations. Once an individual combatant becomes sufficiently visible, sufficiently symbolic, sufficiently useful for propaganda purposes, the institutional logic shifts. The value of preserving the symbol outweighs the value of employing tactical capability. It's not a conspiracy, it's bureaucracy. The system optimizes for control, not for victory. A dead ace is an unacceptable public relations risk, even if they are worth 10 ordinary pilots. David McCampbell's vindication came decades after his death in 1996. Historical analyses of World War II aerial combat tactics repeatedly identified his innovations as precursors to modern fighter doctrines. His techniques for positioning flight elements, his emphasis on energy management in prolonged dogfights, his use of coordination between aircraft to create local tactical advantages. All of this became standard doctrine taught to fighter pilots in the following decades. But these innovations could have changed the outcome of the Pacific War if McCampbell had been allowed to keep flying combat missions. Instead, the Navy chose the path that protected its interests. They preserved their poster boy. They controlled the story. And they surrendered months of elite tactical leadership during the most critical phase of the war. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of David McCampbell's story. Individual excellence, when it becomes too visible, too effective, too symbolic, represents a threat to institutional control. Not an intentional threat, but a systemic one. Because exceptional individuals are unpredictable. They can die. They can fail publicly. They can contradict official narratives through their actions. And institutions, fundamental to their nature, value control over effectiveness. They value manageable narratives over uncontrolled realities. They value the preservation of symbolic assets over the employment of tactical capabilities. The United States Navy won the Pacific War. David McCampbell got the highest decoration any American can receive. But the uncomfortable truth lingers. At the exact moment his skills were most needed, when his tactical mastery could have shifted outcomes, the Navy that he'd devoted his life to chose headlines over firepower. They got their propaganda. They preserved their hero. But they lost their best weapon. And that calculation reveals something fundamental about how military institutions truly operate when narrative control and tactical effectiveness collide. David McCampbell's legacy isn't just his 34 confirmed victories. It isn't just his Medal of Honor. It's the uncomfortable truth his story exposes about institutional priorities. When image becomes more important than capability, when symbol outweighs substance, when bureaucracies choose perceptual safety over tactical superiority. The Navy never publicly admitted to this policy, but the records don't lie. McCampbell's story is the definitive case study of how institutions betray their own effectiveness for the sake of image. They gained a poster boy, but the war lasted longer than necessary because the best weapons were left on the shelf. If you found this examination of how institutions choose propaganda over performance eye-opening, Explore more stories of suppressed innovations linked in the description. And if you want to understand what really goes on inside military bureaucracies when image clashes with effectiveness, subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more of these stories that need telling. Stories where exceptional talent was deliberately sidelined, where results took a backseat to optics, where the best weapons were benched because they'd become too visible, too valuable, too much of a risk. David McCampbell deserved better. But more importantly, the cause he fought for deserved the full use of his capabilities. The Navy chose differently, and that choice speaks a truth about institutional priorities that remains relevant long after World War II.